Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking a deep dive into a political lightning rod that spans continents and centuries. We're talking about the idea of the Bachelor tax, or, as it's currently being debated so intensely in Japan, Shinzai.
It really is one of the most politically charged policy concepts out there right now, and that's
Yeah.
largely because it gets right to this fundamental tension between, state intervention and individual liberty.
Right.
So our mission today is pretty surgical. We need to look past that simple, often inflammatory label of bachelor tax to really understand what's going on underneath. We're essentially examining two very distinct concepts.
Okay.
First, we'll look at the, frankly, catastrophic historical failure of these overt punitive taxes on unmarried or childless people around the globe. And second, we'll see how this controversial idea is sort of reemerging in modern democratic states. Specifically, we're focusing on Japan's new mandatory social insurance mechanism, the Child and Child Rearing Support Fund, which a lot of people see as the modern version of that historic penalty.
Okay, so let's unpack this. It's a huge global discussion. We have these historical case studies that, honestly, they read like cautionary tales. We have hard data from the OECD that shows how modern tax systems already disadvantaged single workers. And then we have this intense analysis of policy mechanics, the economic drivers, and of course the public reaction to Japan's Kodomo Kasadachi Kenseido.
And the core conflict here is it's almost agonizingly simple when you boil it down.
What is it?
It's how do we balance this collective social responsibility, making sure society has the economic foundation and the workforce for the next generation with the democratic principle of respecting an individual's freedom to choose their own life path, whether that includes marriage or children or not.
That tension is exactly why this deep dive is so crucial, I think. Policies that are designed to influence these incredibly fundamental personal choices, they're just inherently risky.
Immensely risky. And we have decades of historical evidence showing that when the state uses a big stick approach, so direct financial penalties tied to your marital status, it consistently, and I mean consistently, backfires. It creates immense social suffering, and it fails to achieve its demographic goals. This history provides the critical lens, really, that we have to use when we analyze the modern Japanese solution.
Okay, so let's start there with the past. Let's get into the era of the big stick, where governments were not at all subtle about penalizing people for not marrying or having kids.
Not subtle at all.
These weren't just minor tax nudges,
Yeah.
right? These were often state policies driven by what seems like sheer demographic panic,
Yeah.
usually after major wars or because of what we now call shishika, or severe low birth rates. What was the core motivation behind these explicit taxes?
Well, the motivation was purely punitive and coercive. The goal was to force marriage and reproduction. They needed warm bodies, essentially, for the next generation to fuel the state, whether that was for the military or for the economy. These were very explicit childless taxes or bachelor taxes that were designed to be felt, to hurt.
And the post-war Soviet bloc provides some of the clearest examples of this and also their failure.
Absolutely. Some of the clearest and most sustained examples.
The most dramatic failure story that's often cited is Bulgaria. They basically ran a 21-year experiment in direct coercion from 1968 to 1989. Can you walk us through their mechanism and the socioeconomic climate it was implemented in?
Right. So Bulgaria's policy was, it was brutal in its simplicity and its scope. It directly targeted unmarried individuals between the ages of 25 and 49. And they levied a massive tax on this group, demanding between 5 to 10% of their total income.
5 to 10%.
10%. And the context here really matters. This was during the communist era, so state control over an individual's life was already immense. The government was desperately trying to reverse these fertility declines that had started back in the 1960s.
10% of your income is not a trivial amount. Especially in a centrally planned economy where disposable income was already so constrained. So what was the demographic result? After 2 decades of this penalty, did they succeed in fixing their population problem?
They failed. Completely. And in a way that provides a really critical lesson for today. Instead of boosting the birth rate, the source material confirms that the country's total fertility rate, the TFR, which is the average number of children born to a woman, it actually decreased during the policy's tenure.
Wait, it went down?
It went down. It dropped from a pre-policy level of 2.18 all the way down to 1.86.
Hold on. If the state's explicit goal was to raise the TFR above the replacement rate, which is about 2.1, and they tasked people for 2 decades to do this, how did the rate fall instead? That seems completely counterintuitive.
It's the paradox of punitive economics. That increased financial burden, that 5 to 10% levy, it just made basic survival more difficult. Young people, especially those in that 25 to 49 bracket who were the most likely candidates for marriage and starting a family, they suddenly found it impossible to save
To save for what?
for major life events, for weddings, for housing deposits, for the actual immense cost of raising a child. The tax created an economic vicious cycle. The penalty for not having children basically ensured they could never afford to have them.
Wow.
And the policy was eventually abolished. There was just massive, undeniable public discontent and, of course, its abject demographic failure.
So taxing poverty doesn't create wealth, and taxing singles doesn't create families if those singles are already financially insecure. It just makes their insecurity worse.
That is the core takeaway. And this wasn't just Bulgaria. The Soviet Union had its own version, the tax on childless citizens, which began way back in 1941.
And how did the Soviet version work? Did it change over its very long lifespan?
It did.
Yeah.
It was initially very sweeping, targeting childless men from age 20 to 50 and childless married women from 20 to 45. The mechanism imposed a tax of up to 6% of income. As time went on, and the demographic issues just kept persisting, the focus sharpened. It eventually started prioritizing childless married women.
And it lasted for a long time.
It was so fundamentally integrated into the Soviet system that it survived decades of policy shifts and economic turmoil. It wasn't finally canceled until 1992, right after the collapse of the Soviet state, which just shows you how persistent these punitive measures can be once they get embedded in the system.
51 years. 51 years of a state-mandated financial penalty based on your family structure. But the dark extreme of this kind of state intervention is often cited as Romania under Nicolae Ceausescu. This wasn't just a tax, was it? It was total governmental control over the reproductive body.
Romania is, well, it's the most chilling case study in policy overreach. Starting in 1967, the Ceausescu regime instituted these high taxes on unmarried or childless individuals over the age of 25, but they paired this financial coercion with a legal system that was just utterly draconian.
How so?
They strictly banned both abortion and contraception. The state was actively interfering with women's health decisions, implementing what was known as the demographic command.
That crosses the line from tax policy into, state-sanctioned medical control. What was the short-term outcome and, more importantly, the long-term tragedy?
Well, there was a short-term spike in the birth rate right after the ban and the tax were implemented, but this demographic success was very quickly overwhelmed by human tragedy. The source material details that the policy led directly to mass abandonment of infants in these overcrowded state orphanages, the infamous Ceausescu's children. On top of that, it caused a steep rise in dangerous illegal abortions and led to a complete and utter collapse of public trust and societal welfare. The expert consensus on all these historical big stick policies is unanimous. Compelling reproduction through financial penalties and personal coercion, it just generates deep societal suffering, violates human rights, fuels resentment, and at the end of the day, it fails its demographic objective.
It's fascinating how persistent this idea is, though, despite such clear failures. We even see echoes of it going all the way back to classical history. Can you just give us a brief reminder of those ancient and early modern precedents?
Oh, the idea is thousands of years old. The Roman Empire under Emperor Augustus, they recognized the demographic threat from their high casualty wars and introduced the Julia Law. And this wasn't just a fine. It imposed penalties on unmarried citizens over a certain age that actually stripped them of crucial rights.
What kind of rights?
The ability to inherit property or to exercise full electoral rights, it was a real societal sanction. And then if you fast forward to the 20th century, fascist Italy under Mussolini also levied specific taxes targeting single men around 1927. It was part of his regime's broader obsession with population expansion and national strength. The historical pattern is clear. Regimes that get obsessed with demographic quotas, they inevitably turn to punitive measures against anyone who doesn't conform.
So, to summarize this historical big stick idea, these explicit direct financial penalties tied to marital or parental status, they consistently fail to reverse birth rate decline.
Exactly. And worse, they exacerbate economic hardship and they generate this profound, justifiable social resentment. This is the foundation we have to keep in mind as we pivot to the modern policy environment.
Okay, that sets a very dark historical precedent. So, the overt punishment taxes largely vanished after the Cold War failures, replaced by subtler mechanisms. But the concept of taxing singles more hasn't disappeared. Now it's manifesting as an invisible single tax that results from the structure of modern OECD tax systems.
Mm.
How has the mechanism shifted from that Bulgarian model to the modern Western model?
The shift is fundamental. The Bulgarian model was a punitive fine added onto your standard tax liability. The modern model is more like differential pricing that's inherent in the structure of income tax and social welfare systems.
What do you mean by differential pricing?
Well, modern OECD nations don't explicitly fine you for being single. Instead, they structurally embed these massive tax advantages and transfer payments for families and for child rearing, which, by mathematical necessity, creates a relative financial disadvantage for a single childless worker who's earning the exact same income. The economic outcome, disproportionately reduced disposable income for singles, is similar, but the political framing is very different. It's framed as social welfare redistribution, not as punishment.
And we can actually quantify this disparity using the OECD's data on the tax wedge. Let's make sure everyone understands that term precisely.
Right. The tax wedge is a crucial economic metric. It measures the total amount of tax that's extracted from a person's labor. Specifically, it's the difference between the labor costs for the employer, including their payroll taxes, and the net disposable income that the employee actually takes home. So it includes income tax, employee-side payroll taxes like Social Security, and employer-side payroll taxes. It's the total effective financial burden on labor.
So what did the 2019 OECD data reveal about the difference in the tax wedge for single workers versus families?
The disparity is consistently wide across all 38 OECD member countries. For a single worker without children earning the average national wage, the average tax wedge in 2019 was a substantial 36% of their pre-tax earnings. Now, you contrast that with a one-earner married couple supporting two children, and the average tax wedge drops dramatically to 26.4%.
That is almost a 10 percentage point difference, 9.6 percentage points. So if I'm a single worker and the family next door is earning the same salary, I am effectively working nearly an extra month per year just to cover the difference in our tax obligations. What are the specific mechanisms that create this nearly 10-point gap?
It's driven entirely by targeted family support. Married couples often benefit from things like joint filing options, which can lower their total household tax liability. But the most significant elements are the targeted relief measures. Substantial child tax credits, which function as direct subsidies or deductions based on how many kids you have, and spouse deductions. In Japan, that's the Haigushakujo, which lowers the taxable income of the primary earner. A single person, regardless of their financial need, simply cannot access these deductions, which leads to a much higher effective tax rate.
So the single worker is basically paying the standard rate, which is then used to fund the significant discounts that are given to the family unit. Which countries show this differential pricing most sharply?
You see the highest tax wedges for singles in countries that have really robust welfare states and high mandatory social contributions. Belgium, for instance, has one of the highest tax wedges for a single worker. It was standing at 52.2% in 2019. Germany is similarly high.
52%.
Yeah. But the moment you calculate the wedge for a family in these same countries, they drop substantially in the global ranking because their tax codes grant enormous family relief. This structure just confirms that the state is using a high base tax rate as the pool from which these massive family subsidies are paid out.
So if Belgium has a 52.2% wedge for a single person, and the family wedge is much lower, that's where the redistribution happens.
Exactly. But the most extreme example of this disparity is Luxembourg. In 2019, Luxembourg showed the largest gap in the entire OECD, a massive 21.1 percentage point difference. A single worker there faced a 38.4% tax wedge, while the equivalent family unit faced only a 17.3% wedge. That is a truly staggering policy disparity in favor of families.
The analogy we used earlier really helps clarify the political interpretation here. It shifts from you're being fined for being single to the family unit is getting a substantial mandated discount, which is effectively financed by the broader working pool. Is this policy goal purely demographic, or is it just seen as a way to ensure family financial stability?
It's largely framed as the latter, as social welfare redistribution aimed at alleviating the substantial financial burden of child rearing, which is viewed as a necessary societal investment. But the economic reality is inescapable. The single worker subsidizes the collective goal. The policy goal may not be punishment, but the economic consequence is a disproportionate reduction in disposable income for those without children. And this modern invisible tax sets the philosophical and economic groundwork for understanding the controversy that's brewing in Japan, where they're attempting to make the subsidy visible and mandatory.
And that takes us directly to Asia. Japan is now facing this massive demographic crisis, which is prompting their government to implement a new system launching in April 2026. And the government is desperately trying to frame this as necessary social insurance. But the public is screaming, Bachelor tax. The formal name is the Child and Child Rearing Support Fund, the Kodomo Cosudate Shenkin Seido. Why is the government so insistent that this is not a tax?
Well, the government is deeply aware of the historical failures we just discussed. They know that policies overtly labeled as penalties for not marrying or not having children are politically toxic and, frankly, probably unconstitutional. So the denial is a strategic political move. They explicitly label it a support fund, a Schenken, which implies a specific purpose and earmarked spending, unlike a general tax. They avoid the word tax, or zai, entirely.
But if it's mandatory and collected by the state, the public is naturally going to call it a tax. How exactly is this mandatory contribution being collected if it's not flowing through the standard income tax system?
This is the critical policy innovation, and it's also the source of the public's frustration. It's collected as an add-on to existing social insurance premiums, specifically public medical insurance, or kurihaken. And this is very strategic. Unlike income tax, which can vary based on deductions, or pension insurance, which has complex rules for enrollment, public medical insurance is mandatory for nearly all residents, employees, the self-employed, even working seniors up to age 75.
So they're using the existing universally mandatory payroll deduction system, the Gensen-Kuki for medical insurance, as a vehicle to collect this new mandatory fee. Why medical insurance specifically? Why not fund it through, say, an increased consumption tax or just general tax revenue? Yeah.
That's a key point of the policy debate. Medical insurance was chosen primarily because it has the broadest base of contributors. It maximizes the resource pool. Relying on consumption tax is politically fraught and very slow. Relying on general tax revenue would have forced the government to cut other programs or face immediate parliamentary opposition. By framing it as a premium attached to social insurance, they're leveraging the implicit social contract of the insurance system. Everyone contributes to mitigate a collective risk. It also makes the mandatory nature less challengeable politically, since social insurance is already universally required in Japan.
Let's talk about the financial scale. The government has framed this as a comprehensive long-term strategy, the children's future strategy. How much money are they trying to raise, and what's the scope of the benefits they're promising?
This is a major structural commitment. The total estimated annual funding need for these reinforced low birth rate measures is about 3.6 trillion JPY. That's roughly 23 billion US dollars. The support fund is designed to generate approximately 1.0 trillion JPY of that annually by 2028. So it's covering roughly a third of the required funding, with the rest coming from budget reallocation and other fiscal reform.
So what exactly will that 3.6 trillion yen pay for? We need to understand the scale of this investment to justify the new mandatory fee.
The investment is extensive. It's aimed at alleviating the most significant financial pain points for families. It includes, first, a massive expansion of child allowances. This involves repealing the income limits that currently disqualify many middle-class families. Benefits will be extended until the child turns 18, and critically, the bonus for the third child and any subsequent children will be significantly increased, potentially up to 30,000 JPY per month, which is a substantial recurring payment.
Okay, what else?
There's childbirth support, so increasing the lump sum childbirth allowance from 420,000 yen to 500,000 yen to better cover the rising costs of delivery and hospital care. Then there's parental leave. An expansion of parental leave benefits, potentially increasing the wage replacement rate for those on leave to around 80% of their original wages, making it more financially viable for both parents to take time off.
And it also covers infrastructure.
Right. Yes, and this is crucial. It involves improving and expanding nursery and after-school facilities and allocating funds specifically to boost the wages of care workers by about 5,000 yen per month. This aims to address the chronic staffing shortages in the childcare sector.
That is clearly a policy aimed at turning the demographic tide by making child rearing more financially attractive and better supported by infrastructure. Now let's look at who pays. Who is the target population for this mandatory fee?
The target population is every single individual who is enrolled in public health insurance who does not claim an under 18 child as a dependent. This universally includes single individuals, de-ank dual income, no kids couples, childless married couples, and working seniors. Basically, all individuals who are currently paying into the Social Security system but are not receiving these new child rearing benefits.
And how significant is the financial burden on that individual?
The burden is calculated as an additional rate on their standard remuneration. It's estimated to be between 0.1 to 0.2%. And the financial burden is split equally between the employee and the employer rushi seppen, which is standard practice for Japanese social insurance premiums.
Let's look at the actual cost simulation, because this is where the public outcry seems so disproportionate to the absolute monetary value. For a typical worker earning, say, 5 million yen annually, what are we talking about per month?
Right. So for a worker earning 5 million yen, which is roughly 32,000 US dollars, the total contribution employee plus employer would be about 500 yen per month. Since the cost is split, the employee's direct payroll deduction would be closer to 250 yen per month, or about 3,000 yen annually. It is income proportional, so low-income individuals pay less in absolute terms, and there's an upper ceiling to prevent excessively high contributions from high-income earners. So yes, in absolute terms, we are talking about the cost of a couple of vending machine coffees per month.
This is where I want to challenge the premise. If the cost is only 250 yen a month for an average worker, a tiny fraction of their disposable income, why is the public overwhelmingly labeling it the bachelor tax? Is the outcry really about the cost, or is it purely about the principle?
It is overwhelmingly about the principle, and that principle is amplified by a deep-seated government distrust. The small size of the fee actually highlights the psychological nature of the resistance. The fundamental critique is what you could call the forced universal contribution limited benefit mismatch.
Explain that mismatch clearly.
Okay, so it's a mandatory fee that's imposed on everyone. But the specific, tangible, high-value benefits, the child allowances, the higher parental leave pay, the subsidized care, they flow exclusively to one specific demographic group, those raising children. So people are asked to pay mandatory dues, but they're implicitly excluded from consuming the service those dues pay for. The source material describes the feeling as being compelled to contribute to a communal pot, knowing you can never take a spoonful out. It's the mandatory contribution for an exclusive benefit that creates the impression of a penalty on those who are excluded.
And this taps directly into existing financial disparities, which creates what people are calling the double burden argument. How does the current Japanese tax system already penalize singles, making this new fee feel like the last straw?
Right. The Japanese tax code has a long tradition of supporting the household structure, primarily through deductions like the spouse deduction, the haigusha kujo. A married couple can lower their taxable income significantly through these mechanisms. Deductions that are entirely unavailable to a single person earning the exact same wage. So a single worker already pays a higher effective tax rate than an equivalent married worker because they don't get these family tax breaks. Critics view the support fund as the third financial layer of discrimination. First, the standard income tax. Second, the lack of family deductions. And now, third, a mandatory fee explicitly for the benefit of the family units that already enjoy the tax breaks the single worker is denied. It just cements the belief that being single means being taxed more, regardless of the government's rhetoric.
And there's a psychological element to this perceived pressure on lifestyle choices.
Oh, that's enormous. The mandatory nature of the fee, combined with the fact that it's earmarked for families, is widely interpreted as the government asserting that those who choose not to marry or have children, or critically those who cannot afford to or are infertile, are somehow socially deficient and must pay a penalty for failing to conform to the state's desired demographic path. This interpretation directly links this modern policy right back to the punitive intent of the historical bachelor taxes, even if the government denies that's the intent.
And none of this is helped by the pervasive sense of government distrust that seems to characterize the Japanese public right now. The government claims this new mandatory contribution won't be a net burden increase because they're promising simultaneous fiscal reform and wage hikes. Why isn't that promise enough to quell the fears?
Because public trust in the government is exceptionally low, which means any policy explanations are immediately met with skepticism. Data from 2021 showed that only 24% of respondents in Japan reported high or moderately high trust in their government. That's dramatically lower than the OECD average of 41.4%. When trust is that low, the promise that we will give you money back later through some vague fiscal reform is just dismissed as political maneuvering. People see the immediate mandatory payroll deduction of 250 yen per month, and that immediate loss of disposable income is real.
It's the difference between a philosophical future promise and an immediate tangible deduction on your paycheck.
Yeah.
And if we loop back to Section I, if young people are already citing financial stress as the primary barrier to marriage and having children, doesn't imposing any new mandatory deduction, even a small one, risk worsening the very Shushika problem they're trying to solve.
That is the core economic critique that dominates the public debate. The government is employing a solution that risks exacerbating the problem. By increasing the mandatory financial pressure on the most economically vulnerable groups, young singles and childless couples, they reduce the disposable income that's necessary for saving for marriage, for housing, and eventually for a family. They are potentially tightening the rope of that same economic vicious circle we saw fail so spectacularly in Bulgaria decades ago. The policy, regardless of its intention, risks becoming self-defeating if it fails to address the root issue of economic insecurity.
We have to anchor this discussion in the sheer existential crisis that's driving this controversial policy. Shushika. Low birth rates aren't just an economic concern in Japan. They are a threat to the fundamental structural integrity of the state. What is the immediate, non-negotiable threat that this inverted demographic pyramid poses to the social safety net?
The most immediate threat is the imminent collapse of the social security system. Japan's structure covering public pensions, universal health care, and long-term care is founded on the intergenerational support model. It's often referred to as pay-as-you-go. So the current working generation pays the benefits for the current elderly generation. With the TFR at a record low of 1.20 as of 2023, and life expectancy increasing drastically, the population pyramid is inverting at speed.
Meaning, fewer and fewer young payers are being required to support a rapidly growing number of elderly beneficiaries.
Exactly. The system just becomes mathematically unsustainable. The financial foundation is fundamentally undermined. To stabilize it, the government only has two real options: drastically cut benefits, which is politically impossible, or continually raise the mandatory contributions on the working generation. The support fund is a direct manifestation of this compulsion. It's a desperate measure to secure the next generation of payers who will, in turn, sustain the system that current workers are relying on.
Beyond the social safety net, how does this crisis act as a powerful brake on the wider macroeconomy, affecting everything from investment to innovation?
The impact is felt simultaneously on both the demand side and the supply side of the economy. On the demand side, a shrinking, aging population means the domestic consumer market inevitably contracts. Older populations generally consume less across various sectors, especially things like housing and durable goods. This lack of domestic demand discourages local investment and leads to what economists call industrial hollowing out. Businesses either relocate or shift their focus overseas because there's just not enough domestic market growth potential left in Japan.
And what about the crucial supply side of the economy?
On the supply side, we face a critical loss of economic dynamism and talent. Economic growth, particularly technological progress and innovation, it relies heavily on the entry of young talent, typically that 15 to 34 age group. They bring fresh perspectives, energy, and familiarity with cutting-edge technology. A rapid decline in the absolute number of people entering this core workforce age group just impedes productivity gains and ensures that the economy trends toward zero or even negative growth because the labor supply is shrinking faster than productivity can increase.
And this brings us back to that vicious circle, a loop that feels inescapable.
It is. The costs of sustaining the aging social structure increase because of Shushika, which forces the government to find new revenue streams like the support fund. This increased mandatory financial pressure then reduces disposable income for young people, making the decision to marry and have children even less affordable, which then further exacerbates Shushika. The crisis feeds on the attempted solutions.
Given the intensity of the public and economic critique, the government and its proponents must have a robust philosophical defense. They seem to hinge their argument on the principles of indirect benefit and the very nature of social insurance. So let's start with that indirect benefit rationale. Why should a single, childless 40-year-old worker be compelled to fund someone else's child allowance?
The key argument is that the burden sharing is essential because everyone benefits indirectly from the existence of the next generation. That single 40-year-old worker will, one day, retire. Their pension, their continued health care, their eventual long-term care. It will all be funded by the taxes and insurance premiums paid by the children who are currently being raised. So by funding child rearing now, they're purchasing the long-term sustainability and stability of the very public social security systems they themselves will rely upon for the rest of their lives.
So the government is saying, you're not paying for this month's child allowance. You're paying for the stability of your own pension and health care 30 years from now.
Precisely. It shifts the calculus from an immediate cost-benefit analysis to an intergenerational investment strategy. And this leads right into their core defense, the social insurance principle. Social insurance is fundamentally a mechanism for horizontal redistribution across the life cycle, not just vertical redistribution from rich to poor.
We often think of Social Security in that vertical sense, those who can pay more, subsidizing those who need it. How does the support fund specifically leverage the concept of horizontal redistribution across the life cycle?
Well, social insurance addresses two specific types of horizontal risk. First, there's time-based redistribution. This is the standard pension model. You pay mandatory premiums during your active, high-income working years to secure guaranteed income and support during the inevitable low-income or high-risk periods, like old age or disability. The support fund applies this by compelling current workers to pay now to secure the future stability that benefits them later.
And the second type is where child rearing fits in risk-based redistribution. This is the conceptual leap the government is asking the public to make.
Absolutely. The defense treats child rearing as a major life risk that society should collectively insure against. Think about it. Raising children incurs substantial, unavoidable costs and often leads to significant income reduction, especially during parental leave. This is viewed as a high-risk financial event that benefits society as a whole, but which no single family can easily bear alone. Just as society pools resources through unemployment insurance to cover the risk of losing a job, social insurance pools resources through the support fund to mitigate the financial risk inherent in having and raising the next generation.
And strategically, choosing the medical insurance collection route ensures this risk is shared by the largest possible group.
It was a conscious, tactical choice. Medical insurance provides mandatory contributions from the broadest economic spectrum: all employees, all self-employed, all working seniors. This broad base is essential to secure that massive 1.0 trillion yen target needed to address Shishika. Proponents argue this broad mandatory premium is the only way to achieve the necessary scale of funding. They contrast it with general taxation, which is subject to political whims and budgetary pressures. Critics, however, argue that using a mandatory premium that functions exactly like a tax is just an easy legislative route to raise revenue without facing the rigorous democratic scrutiny required for formal taxation.
Whether the government calls it a premium or a support fund, the public clearly views it as a mandatory fee that discriminates against their lifestyle. This automatically places the policy on a collision course with fundamental law. What are the core legal challenges being raised by constitutional experts in Japan?
The fundamental legal conflict is whether the state's mandatory imposition of a financial burden, tied to a limited beneficiary group like child-rearing families, violates core constitutional principles of equality and freedom. Even if the state's intent is macro-social benefit, this is a very, very fine line in constitutional law.
Let's start with the most obvious legal conflict. Article 14, the right to equality. How do critics frame the support fund as a violation of this constitutional pillar?
Okay, so Article 14 guarantees equality under the law and strictly prohibits discrimination based on social status or class. Critics argue that marital status, parental status, and the choice to have children are inherently matters of individual free will and protected lifestyle choices. To impose a mandatory financial burden based specifically on the absence of a child dependent, they argue, constitutes unfair discrimination. They say the state is effectively punishing, or at least financially disadvantaging, a citizen based on their personal life choices, which Article 14 is designed to prevent.
This issue of financial maneuvering also brings us to Article 84, which deals with taxation by law. Since the government refuses to call this a tax, how can it potentially violate the law regarding taxation?
Article 84 is a fundamental safeguard of fiscal democracy. It demands that all taxes must be established by a formal law passed by the National Diet, which ensures rigorous democratic debate and oversight. Critics argue that by labeling the support fund an insurance premium, or a Schenken, the government is essentially creating a gray zone funding mechanism. This mandatory deduction raises revenue that behaves exactly like a tax, but it bypasses the stringent democratic scrutiny required for a formal tax increase. They suggest this undermines the principle of taxation by law, allowing the executive branch to raise significant mandatory public revenue through an easier quasi-insurance mechanism.
And finally, the most abstract but essential rights. Article 13, respect for the individual, and Article 25, right to subsistence. How is this financial fee seen as infringing upon personal dignity or standard of living?
These articles protect individual dignity and the right to maintain a minimum standard of healthy and cultural living. Critics contend that imposing additional, non-optional costs, even if they are small in absolute terms, on economically vulnerable individuals, particularly those who are already struggling financially and cannot afford to marry or have children, can be viewed as infringing on their basic standard of living. And it also touches on dignity. By mandating a payment exclusively for the benefit of families, the policy implicitly positions those who are single or childless as socially deficient or less valuable to the state, forcing them to compensate financially for their non-contribution to the future generation.
What's the outlook from legal experts?
The outlook is sobering. They caution that if the support fund is implemented, it is highly likely to become the target of immediate constitutional lawsuits. The conflict between the mandatory universal collection and the highly specific limited beneficiary pool inherently clashes with established legal principles of equality and personal freedom. It mirrors the foundational human rights critiques that were successfully leveled against historical punitive taxes in places like Europe. The state is essentially testing the legal limits of coercion for demographic stability.
That distinction, coercion for demographic stability versus respect for individual freedom, is the line the government is walking right now.
It is the ultimate tightrope walk. The government has to solve an undeniable generational problem demographic collapse. But if the solution tramples on the individual rights and choices protected by the Constitution, the policy will fail both legally and socially. The state has to find a solution that ensures collective financial sustainability while preserving human dignity and freedom of choice.
This deep dive has really laid bare the striking continuum between the old punitive fine model of the Bachelor tax, which we saw fail so catastrophically in Bulgaria and Romania, and the modern controversy swirling around Japan's support fund. While the intent has shifted from pure punishment to desperately funding an existential demographic crisis, the public reaction remains rooted in that same feeling: unfair coercion and government overreach. The policy challenge in Japan isn't just economic, it's philosophical and it's legal.
And the challenge facing Japan and many other wealthy, aging OECD nations is a fundamental dilemma. They have to secure a financial mechanism that is robust enough to fund the future of the collective safety net, pensions, healthcare, future economic dynamism, and financially support the families that are producing the next generation. Yet that mechanism must also be financially effective, broadly equitable, and crucially, respect the freedom of individual life choices. When the state imposes a financial burden that is mandatory, universally applied, yet tied specifically to a demographic metric, it risks being perceived as the very punitive tax that history proves only leads to social discontent, political backlash, and ultimately policy failure.
So we have seen that the historical big stick of direct punishment fails. We know that in many countries, even massive cash subsidies and robust social support are proving insufficient to reverse the catastrophic decline in the birth rate. This leaves us facing a massive, enduring question for the future of democratic governance.
Given the urgency of demographic collapse, if direct financial coercion is unethical and ineffective, and targeted financial support is insufficient, what new model of shared financial responsibility can a modern, free democratic society ethically implement? One that ensures the long-term sustainability of the collective safety net without punishing, penalizing, or implicitly imposing a value judgment on citizens for their individual life choices. That is the ultimate conundrum of policy design in the 21st century, a dilemma that will define whether nations like Japan can sustain themselves. Something for you to mull over as you navigate the news this week.